You are not listening to these words by accident. Something in you has been moving toward this moment for a long time, like a tide turning in the dark without anyone noticing on the shore. On the surface, it may look like just another video, another voice in the endless stream. But in the language of depth psychology, what draws you here has another name: synchronicity. It is as if the unconscious has quietly braided your inner exhaustion, your unspoken questions, and this precise message into one invisible thread, and now you find yourself at the end of it, holding on, unable to pretend you do not see. For a long time, you have lived inside a certain equilibrium. Outwardly, your life may even look balanced. You know how to smile, how to be reasonable, how to say, "It's fine, I understand." In Jungian terms, this is your persona, the social mask you wear to be accepted, to belong, to function. The persona is not a lie. It is a necessary interface with the world. But when a woman begins to starve behind her own mask, when her real hunger for love and presence is reduced to crumbs, a fissure opens. The persona starts to crack, not dramatically at first, but as a subtle inner tremor. Something in me is not okay. That tremor often begins in the body before it becomes a clear thought. You may notice a tightness in your chest when his name appears on your phone after days of silence, a mix of relief, anxiety, and a strange shame for being so easily appeased by so little. You might feel a hollow ache in your stomach when he cancels plans at the last minute, followed by the automatic reflex to say, "No worries, maybe next time." Your shoulders tense when you rehearse messages and then erase them, waiting for him to make the first move so you don't appear too much. These are not random sensations. They are the language of the psyche, speaking through the body, signaling that you are living below your soul standard. Jung would say that a tension is forming between your ego, the conscious part of you that tries to manage, explain, and justify, and a deeper center he called the self, the totality of who you are meant to be. The self does not speak in arguments. It speaks in persistent feelings and dreams, in that quiet sense of something is off that will not go away. When you settle for crumbs from a man who gives the minimum, the self begins to protest. It whispers at first, "Notice this pattern. Notice how often you wait. Notice how much you shrink." You have likely told yourself that a little is better than nothing, that his sporadic presence is still presence, that his "I miss you" after days of absence is proof that you matter. This is how the psyche defends itself from the pain of seeing clearly. In Jungian language, we could say that a complex has been activated, perhaps a father complex or an old wound around being chosen, being enough, being seen. A complex is an emotionally charged pattern rooted in past experience that pulls you into the same story again and again without your conscious consent. You don't just meet this man. You meet every man who ever made you feel like you had to earn your place. So you justify. You explain his behavior to your friends, but mostly to yourself. He's busy. He's not good with messages. He's just afraid of commitment. You tell yourself these things not because you are foolish, but because you are loyal to the hope that this time, if you give enough weight, enough, understand enough, you will finally be fully chosen. Yet underneath that loyalty lives an even deeper truth. Every time you accept less than you need, you betray yourself to protect the illusion that he might change. The first movement of awakening is not loud. It is not a dramatic argument, not a scene. It is the moment you stop asking, "What is wrong with me?" that he gives so little, and begin to ask, "What is wrong with this pattern that I call this love?" That subtle shift in question is the crack in the old world. It is the beginning of individuation, the Jungian term for the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are rather than who you were trained to be. Individuation often begins in precisely these places, the quiet recognition that your soul is starving while your ego keeps saying, "This is fine." You might be standing in that recognition now, tired, confused, half defending him, half defending yourself, feeling a strange mixture of loyalty and resentment. This is the threshold, the place where the old story still has its hands on you, but another deeper story has already begun. There comes a moment in a woman's life when the world outside continues exactly as it always has, but something inside her shifts with the weight of an ancient truth returning to memory. She notices the imbalance, not because it suddenly appears, but because she finally stops numbing herself to it. What she once interpreted as mystery now reveals itself as avoidance. What she once romanticized as giving him space now feels like erasure. The spell breaks slowly, like waking from a dream where the symbols rearrange themselves into clarity. And in that clarity, she begins to see him and herself without the distortions of longing. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when the unconscious steps forward with its lantern illuminating the pattern that has been silently shaping your choices. You discover that he gives you crumbs, not because you are lacking, but because that is the only currency he knows how to offer. His restraint, his sporadic affection, his selective presence. These are not commentaries on your worth. They are artifacts of his own emotional limitations. When Jung spoke of the shadow, he described it as the part of the personality that remains unacknowledged, unintegrated, often projected onto others. A man who avoids depth often does so because his own shadow terrifies him. Intimacy threatens to expose the very qualities he has spent a lifetime hiding from himself. You may feel this on a somatic level long before you understand it intellectually. Something in your body recoils at his inconsistency. Something in you recognizes the hollowness of his gestures, even as your heart tries to make poetry out of his fragments. This conflict within you is the psyche attempting to reconcile two opposing forces, the desire for connection and the fear of losing the fantasy. Every time you justify his absence, you preserve the fantasy. Every time you glimpse the truth, the fantasy dissolves a little more. Many women confuse a man's emotional minimalism with mystery depth or sensitivity. But Jung would remind you that deprivation creates projection. When someone gives you very little, your imagination supplies the rest. You begin to fill the empty spaces with meaning, interpreting silence as complexity, distance as independence, inconsistency as woundedness that you must heal. This is not love. This is the archetypal feminine instinct to repair, to nurture, to make sense of chaos by offering wholeness. But when that instinct is directed toward someone who cannot meet you, it becomes self-abandonment disguised as devotion. What he gives has everything to do with his developmental history, the attachments he formed, the wounds he carries, the archetypal patterns that govern his psyche. Some men learned early that affection is dangerous, that closeness leads to exposure, that intimacy invites loss. Others fear strong women, because a strong woman evokes the anima, the inner feminine, which they have never learned to relate to consciously. In Jungian theory, the anima represents a man's inner emotional life intuition and relational capacity. If he is not integrated as anima, he will treat your depth as a threat rather than an invitation. But none of this is your responsibility. The psyche seeks wholeness, not martyrdom. You are not here to mother a man's arrested emotional development. You are not here to translate his silence into meaning or to call your hunger patience. You came into this life with an inner blueprint, the self, a center of order, meaning, and psychological destiny. That self will not allow you to starve forever. When your soul has had enough, it sends the wake-up call through exhaustion, resentment, numbness, or a sudden flash of insight that feels like a cold wind through the room. The moment you stop twisting yourself to accommodate his limitations, the self begins to reclaim you. This is the beginning of withdrawal. The liminal phase Jung described as the space between two worlds, the world where you accepted crumbs and the world where you no longer hunger for anything less than reciprocity. Withdrawal is not punishment. It is the psyche preparing for descent, a turning inward, a gathering of light before you enter the deeper chambers of your own unconscious. There is a moment in every true psychological journey when the outer story quiets and the inner one begins to speak with unmistakable authority. You may feel it as a heaviness behind the ribs, a sense that you can no longer participate in the script you once followed so faithfully. This is the descent, not a collapse, but a chosen entry into the deeper layers of your own psyche. Jung compared this phase to the mythic journeys where the heroine must leave the ordinary world and travel into the underworld to reclaim what was lost. And what you have lost, perhaps without noticing, is yourself. The descent does not begin with rage or accusation, though anger may accompany you like a faithful animal. It begins with a subtle refusal. You stop answering messages immediately. You stop rearranging your life around his whims. You stop pretending that the crumbs satisfy you. Your silence becomes a boundary, and your boundary becomes a mirror. When you withdraw the energy that once held the dynamic together, you confront something terrifying and liberating, the realization that the entire relationship was sustained by your effort, your hope, your imagination. What remains in the space you clear is the truth, unromantic, undeniable, and quietly devastating. This is where the shadow emerges. The shadow is not only the part of you that holds anger, grief, and unmet needs, it also holds your unclaimed power, your intuition, your ferocity, your capacity for truth. When you stop accepting crumbs, the shadow steps forward and asks, "Why did you believe this was all you deserved?" The question does not come as accusation. It comes as initiation. Beneath the anger lies grief, and beneath the grief lies clarity. You begin to see the architecture of your longing, how old wounds shaped what you tolerated, how patterns in your feminine lineage whispered acceptance of too little, how the father complex quietly taught you to work for the affection that should have been freely given. The father complex is not merely about one man. It is an archetypal imprint. It is the way your psyche learned to relate to the masculine principle: authority, validation, direction, presence. If your early encounters with the masculine were inconsistent, withholding, or unpredictable, you may unconsciously gravitate toward men who replicate that pattern, hoping to resolve what was left unresolved. Jung believed that repetition is the psyche's attempt at healing. But healing does not occur through endurance. It occurs through recognition. When you finally see the pattern, the spell begins to break. In the underworld of your unconscious, you encounter not just your personal history, but the collective memory of women who came before you. Their stories echo through your instincts: the grandmother who stayed quiet, the mother who loved men who did not stay, the aunt who dimmed her light to protect someone else's comfort. These patterns form a psychic inheritance, a feminine lineage that lives in your body. When you confront them, you do not only face your own wounds, you face the wounds of generations. And as you loosen their grip on you, you loosen them for those who will come after you. This inner work is not abstract. You feel it somatically. Your breath deepens, your posture changes, your voice steadies. You stop apologizing for existing. You stop waiting for crumbs because you finally feel, not just think, that you deserve the whole loaf. This shift is not arrogance, it is alignment. It is the ego beginning to reorganize itself around the self, the center of wholeness that has been waiting for you to remember it. When a woman reaches this stage, something extraordinary happens. Her eros, the living, breathing life force within, begins to return. Eros is not sexuality alone. It is vitality, imagination, creativity, the impulse to connect with the world in meaningful ways. As Eros awakens, the man who once consumed her attention becomes small in her inner landscape, not because she diminishes him, but because she expands. You stand now at the threshold between who you have been and who you are becoming. Ahead lies sovereignty, clarity, and a form of love that begins within and radiates outward. But before you rise, you must finish the descent. In the deepest chamber of descent, where the old stories lose their authority and the psyche stands unclothed, a woman encounters a truth she could not see while she was still hoping for crumbs. It is here, in this quiet and interior darkness, that she finally meets the one person who has been absent from her life for far too long: herself. Not the persona she crafted for love, not the accommodating self she learned to become, but the raw, instinctive sovereign core that Jung would call the self, the totality of who she is and who she is meant to become. At first, this encounter feels like a rupture. The ego, which has spent years navigating relationships through compromise, self-minimization, or quiet endurance, resists. It wants to return to the familiar pattern, the known discomfort, the predictable ache. The ego clings to the fantasy that if you just wait long enough or give just a little more, he will finally offer the fullness you long for. But the self has no patience for fantasies that diminish you. It speaks in a language older than thought, older than personality, a pulsing insistence that there is more for you than this. In Jungian terms, this is the confrontation between ego and self, the central drama of individuation. The ego fears dissolution, the self demands expansion, and the tension between them produces a kind of inner heat, a psychic alchemy. You may feel it as restlessness, sleeplessness, a sudden aversion to old habits, or even a strange calm that feels foreign in its steadiness. This alchemical heat burns away illusions, leaving only what is essential. You begin to see that his crumbs were not nourishment, but distraction, a way of avoiding the deeper work of becoming who you truly are. As you stay in this inner underworld, something profound shifts in your perception of the man who once held such power over you. You no longer experience his inconsistency as mystery or depth. You see it as smallness, not moral smallness, but psychological smallness. A man who gives crumbs does so because his psyche is structured around avoidance, control, or fear. He may be charming, intelligent, or emotionally sensitive in fragments, but fragments are not wholeness. Fragments cannot sustain a relationship with a woman who is returning to herself. And this is where you begin to mirror him, not out of resentment, but out of accuracy. You give back exactly what he gives you, not as punishment, but as a reflection of reality. Where he is absent, you become unavailable. Where he offers sporadic affection, you respond in kind. Where he withdraws you, do not chase. And in this mirrored dance, he confronts something he has never seen before, the truth of his own limitations. For the first time, he cannot rely on your effort to sustain the dynamic. He cannot disappear for days and expect you to wait in suspended animation. He cannot offer crumbs and watch you feast on them as though they were a banquet. When your energy is no longer his emotional fuel, he feels the collapse of a system that once revolved around his comfort. Some men respond with panic, some with anger, some with seductive promises, and some with silence. But none of these responses are your concern. The mirror is not held for him, it is held for you. It reveals not only who he is, but who you have been. You see the places where you overgave, overfunctioned, overhoped. And as the mirror turns inward, you encounter a deeper layer of shadow, the part of you that believed scarcity was normal, that acceptance required endurance, that love was something earned rather than received. This shadow is not your enemy, it is your teacher. It carries the memory of every moment you learned to make yourself small in order to be chosen. When a woman reaches this stage, she begins to rise not outwardly at first, but inwardly. Her voice becomes steadier. Her boundaries become clearer. Her time becomes more precious. She stops asking what he wants and begins to ask what she desires. This is the reorganization of the psyche around a new center of gravity. This is Eros returning not as longing for a man, but as devotion to life itself. As the ascent begins, you feel an unfamiliar spaciousness inside you, the space once occupied by waiting, longing, and explaining. This newly liberated psychic energy flows into other places: creativity, friendships, solitude, work, dreams, the quiet joy of being with yourself without needing someone else to fill the silence. The man who once consumed your inner world becomes a small figure on the horizon, still visible, but no longer central. And this decentralization is not cruelty. It is liberation. From here, the rising continues slow and steady, like a tide reclaiming a shore. As you rise from the underworld of your own unconscious, something astonishing begins to unfold. The world does not change, Not its streets, not its clocks, not the faces that pass you on ordinary mornings, but your perception of it shifts with tectonic force. You begin to move through your life with a new tempo, a new gravity. The air feels different, not because it has changed, but because you have. Jung wrote that when the individual aligns with the self, the personality reorganizes around a deeper center of meaning. This is the moment when you stop orbiting around another person's inconsistency and begin to inhabit your own axis. The ascent is not dramatic. It does not require declarations or confrontations. In fact, there is an exquisite quietness to it. You no longer need to explain why you are withdrawing from the man who offered so little. You no longer need to announce your standards or justify your choices. There is no performance in this stage, only embodiment. What once felt like effort now becomes instinct. You do not answer messages that arrive like afterthoughts. You do not rearrange your days for someone who never rearranged theirs for you, and you do not accept proximity without presence. This is not strategy, it is self-respect. And as you settle into this new altitude of consciousness, something begins to reveal itself: psychological loneliness, not the loneliness of abandonment, but the loneliness that accompanies sovereignty. Jung often wrote that individuation requires the courage to stand alone, not forever, but long enough to hear the sound of your own inner voice without distortion. This loneliness is not emptiness, it is clarity. It is the spaciousness of a psyche no longer crowded by longing for crumbs. It is the quiet where the self becomes audible. From this position, you can finally see the man who once captivated you with startling clarity. You no longer view him through projection, the unconscious tendency to overlay our unlived inner life onto another person. Without projection, he appears smaller but truer, a man limited not by malice, but by lack of depth, lack of integration, lack of inner courage. You see that what you interpreted as mystery was avoidance. What you mistook for emotional complexity was inconsistency. And what you romanticized as sensitivity was merely his need to receive care without ever offering the same in return. Yet something extraordinary happens here. You do not hate him. You do not resent him. You simply outgrow him. He becomes part of a chapter that taught you how easily a woman can abandon herself for the hope of being chosen, and how fiercely she can rise when she remembers she was never meant to beg for what should be freely given. As you continue rising, Eros, the creative life-affirming force, returns to you not as hunger, but as vitality. You feel drawn to projects that nourish you, friendships that reflect you, solitude that strengthens you. You find yourself laughing again, dreaming again, building again. Your attention, once poured into a man who could not receive it, now irrigates the soil of your own becoming. The energy you once used to decipher mixed signals transforms into the energy that animates your new life. And eventually, almost inevitably, he feels it. Men who give crumbs often sense energetically when the woman who once fed the dynamic has stepped out of it. He may return with familiar lines. I miss you, I've been thinking. Things are different now, but you hear them differently. The spell has been broken. You no longer respond to crumbs because you no longer see them as food. Change without consistent action is no longer convincing. Longing without presence no longer moves you. Words without embodiment no longer seduce you. If he cannot rise, you do not descend. That is the new law of your psyche. And so you step into the final stage of this journey, the homecoming to the self. You understand now that your worthiness was never in question. It was simply undiscovered. You realize that you were never asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person. You see that the true feminine is not defined by endurance or self-sacrifice, but by clarity, boundaries, instinct, and depth. You no longer seek validation from the masculine, because you have integrated the masculine within yourself. Structure, sovereignty, discernment. You discover at last a timeless truth that will anchor you for the rest of your life. A woman becomes unstoppable the moment she no longer waits to be chosen, because she finally chooses herself. If this journey resonated with you, I invite you to stay connected. Like this video, share it with someone who needs its medicine, and subscribe. If you want to continue exploring Jungian depth, psychology, feminine consciousness, and the inner transformations that shape a sovereign life, I would love to hear your reflections. Leave a comment below and tell me where you are in your own journey of awakening.